G'day guys, in today's video we're going to talk about military sporters and why I think they're pretty bloody cool. So a lot of people out there don't like military sporters, and I can see why they don't. But I feel like they may not appreciate the history behind these military sporters, and this is the reason I love them. So let's delve a little bit into it. We're going to set the scene. It's the end of the 1800s, we're going into the 1900s, and the current British service rifle is the Lee Metford. So British officers, when they're deploying to places like British India, Australia, Africa, they want to have a rifle to take with them for hunting wild game while they're out on their deployment. So this is where we run into the Lee Speed. Now, there's a few different versions of a Lee Speed. You have a Lee Speed built of a Lee Metford, and then you have a Lee Speed built of a Lee Enfield. Now, the difference between those two is not really so much the action, it's more so the barrel with the different types of rifling for the different cartridges. They had these rifles built to take with them and go hunting. So when the British encountered the Boers in the Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, that's when they fully first came up against the 7 Mauser. Now, the Americans had a similar thing in the same period when they were fighting the Spanish, and the Spanish were also armed with a Mauser chambered in 7x57 Mauser. Smokeless cartridges were only really a new thing. Everything before that had been black powder. This is the first time they've fully gone head to head with a proper small bore, flat shooting, high velocity cartridge. And they figured, wow, that's pretty bloody good. And it's the first time they've encountered Mausers. They've gone, you know what, these things are pretty bloody good. And it became a popular thing of like, I've got a captured Mauser. Then you've got this British company called Rigby. I'm sure you've heard of it. They were traditionally there for building double rifles. And what Rigby started doing was importing Mauser actions, and they would start building sporting rifles on these Mauser actions because everyone knew about it. Everyone knew that the Mauser was the best action, the Mauser 98. So they start building these rifles. And then in 1900, Mauser, specifically for Rigby, starts making an extended receiver for these Mausers with a slightly larger bolt face, and this was to accompany what we now call a Mauser Magnum action. And this was so Rigby could build big bore rifles on this ubiquitous Mauser action. Now, these were sold all through up until World War I, and everyone wanted a Mauser. But then World War I starts, and we're now fighting the Germans, right? Becomes a little bit less popular in Britain, particularly, to associate yourself with the Germans, and to be importing things from Germany. They're at a time of war. This is one of the reasons why you'll see 7x57 Mauser referred to as 275 Rigby. That happened in that kind of period as well. So that 7x57 Mauser, or the 275 Rigby cartridge, became quite popular, particularly from hunters such as Harry Shelby and Karamojo Bell. Bell was the bloke, you may have heard of him, who was shooting elephants with a 7x57 headshots. So it kind of spurred on the popularity of that cartridge. Now, let's go post-World War I. We're into the 20s. The Brits are still big on their double rifles because it's seen as a uniquely British thing, having a big bore double rifle. The Americans have started bringing home captured German G98s from World War I. They've also got a shitload of leftover Springfield 1903s, and then they end up getting sold into the civilian market. Now, you've got this rifle that is covered in wood, unnecessarily. The only reason the wood is there to protect the rifle, and that leads itself into military service and not so much walking around in the deer woods. So people start removing a bit of the wood. Now, when they take these rifles home, they do what's called a duffel cut, where they're cutting the stock at the band line. So they've already got a stock that's kind of already cut. They just take the top wood off, take the front wood off, and they've got this little sporter thing. Now, this was a good way for some people to get their hands on, Rigby had these awesome rifles pre-war. Well, now I can't really afford a Rigby because I'm poor, but what I can afford is this Milsurp dime a dozen rifle. Right, so they're then going to build their they're going to build their custom rifle off this military action, and there's a few little tweaks you need to do to make it a bit more civilianised and to make it a little bit better for use. because let's face it, military rifles aren't really that great. And sometimes the design features on them don't really fit use, they just fit drill, they fit whatever the fuck the generals want. So sometimes they're not the best rifles in the world. So this civilian can get this action and build his dream gun. He can do it on the cheap, and he can say, hey, you know what? I've got a Mauser in the closet. And people go, ooh, it's a bit ritzy. Where'd you get that one, Johnny boy? Oh, it fell off the back of a truck, didn't it? So in Australia, similar things are happening, right? We've got the Lee Enfields. We've got our Lee Enfields that are made in Lithgow. There's a shitload of BSAs in the country because they've come from World War I as well. And they've made their way into the sporting shooting market. Particularly for target shooters, this is where the heavy barrel thing comes in, which I'm sure you've heard me talk about in other SMLE videos. Lithgow started spinning up all these heavy barrels so that when you take all the wood off, you don't lose your accuracy. Now, it's not heavy barrel in what we modern day people think of a heavy barrel. The contour on a SMLE heavy barrel is probably very similar to a standard sporting barrel these days. But back then that was a heavy barrel because an SMLE standard barrel is very, very thin, and when you take the wood off, it's generally pretty accurate because there's too much whip in it, because it changes the harmonics and it really needs that wood for support to the barrel to make it accurate. Those rifles as well aren't really built for, you know, what we would call accuracy. You know, a group like that at 100, particularly back then, that's good. The SMLEs were made for minute of man, so chest-size shots. And then we go into World War II, and this is where we really see this era of sporterized rifles, because they weren't really considered sporterized milsurps before World War II. They were just rifles because there wasn't really that massive delineation between this is a military rifle and this is a sporting rifle, because there weren't companies really making many proper sporting hunting rifles. One thing that Remington was doing was they were producing the M17, so we got the P14, M17 family of rifles, when America started using the M17, which is the 30-06 version of the P14, and it was actually their most used rifle, not the Springfield 1903, which is what they always crap on about. Every painting and every photo you're ever going to see is propaganda, because not many of them were actually used during World War I. It was mostly M17s. Anyway, what Remington was already tooled up to make those, so then they started pumping them out for the civilian market with a few little tweaks as the Remington Model 30. So this is one of your first, I would say, commercial military rifles. So we're in World War II. Once again, we can't import Mausers from the Germans. Everyone's up in arms. There's not that many civilian rifles getting made because all of rifle production is going into rifles for the military. Now, when you have factories set up for wartime, in the peacetime you need to continue making things, otherwise the factories go down. You need to maintain your tooling, you need to maintain your skills with your workers, all that sort of stuff. That's why a lot of these companies who make stuff for military also make civilian stuff. So like Daewoo, they make guns. They also make a fucking lot of everything else, including cars. We have Lithgow. Lithgow makes civilian firearms to keep the factory churning when it's not making military firearms, and that factory is realistically there to make military firearms. Particularly this period, it's there to make Lee Enfields. In the interwar years, that's when you've got, you know, the Lithgow Model 1 or whatever it is, the shitty 22, and you've got all these other bloody Lithgow things. They're realistically just doing that to maintain the skills, maintain the machinery. Wartime spins up and they go, Lee Enfields again. World War II ends and we have an influx of milsurped rifles again. We have a shitload of SMLEs in Australia. One thing that's kind of weird in the period of like 1946 to like, I think it was 1951-ish, somewhere in that period, the Australian government banned the use of 303 because it's a military cartridge. As a civilian, you weren't allowed to own it. And that's where we had the rise of 303-25, 303-270, 303-243, 303-35, 303-22, all these different Wildcat cartridges. Whether we've got a shitload of these cart cases, we're not allowed to own it. Let's just nick it down to something else. It's not a military cartridge then, and then we can use all these milsurped rifles as a good modern hunting rifle. So in America, they're doing a similar thing as well. There's a shitload of imported German K98s. Not so much on the Japanese front. You don't really see many sporterized Jap guns, and that's because there wasn't that many of them around, but there was literally millions of K98s imported into various different countries around the world. If you've got all of these guns sitting there, obviously people are going to chop them up and want to use them. One of the easiest conversions to do for the Yanks was they had a shitload of 30-06 cartridges, then they had these 8mm barrels for these K98s. So they would just get a 30-06 reamer, re-ream the chamber, and then take out a 30 cal bullet, put in an 8mm bullet, and now you've got an 8mm 06, and that was a pretty good wildcat during those 1950s era. Now this is where rifles take a bit of a turn for the worst, in my opinion, is the 1950s to 1960s period. Because of advances in technology such as polyurethane. I fucking hate polyurethane with a burning passion. It cracks really easy. You then get water under the cracks and into your stock and it wrecks your stock. It's a pain in the ass to take off, and pretty much any gun in that period has got fucking polyurethane on it, and it burns my piss. But during this period, we have a shitload of milsurps. What are you going to do with them all? Not every single one of them can be a collector, right? Things only really gain value when there's not many of them left. Now, when there's heaps of them, they're not worth anything. Now, if you've got these worthless rifles, what are you going to do with them? Are you going to go out and go to Remington and buy the brand new Remington 700s, just hit the market, or the Winchester Model 70 that's just hit the market, all those really good hunting rifles, and they cost you an arm and a leg, right? But you're just a poor metal worker, or a poor baker, or a milkman, or a school teacher, because everyone knows they earn fuck all. And you go into this gun shop and there's just crates and crates of K98s that are going for $3. Or you could buy a Remington 700 for $50, which is probably a couple months' wage. What do? Obviously you're going to buy the cheap one, aren't you? We do it today when we go, oh, do I want to pay $3,000 for this rifle, or do I want to pay $1,000 for this rifle? Most of you are going to go the $1,000 rifle unless you're really, really enthusiastic about it. Then you do some tweaks, you do some stock work. You might go, you know what, I could build a stock, and you do it yourself. It might look like shit, but you like it because you built it. When it gets sold on, everyone goes, that's horrendous. But in your mind, in your eye, that's a really cool gun because you built it, you made it. Now, as militaries moved into the semi-automatic world, Australians and Brits get the SLR. The Yanks go M14, M16. We've got most NATO countries in the world are using SLR. We've got G33s and all these other semi-automatics. So this is in the 60s, 70s. Less and less people are using bolt-action rifles. So more and more people are buying them up cheap and using them as civilian hunting and sporting rifles. And then eventually we start drying up on our stocks of these milsurp rifles. Now they start becoming collectible, but only because there's less of them left. If we didn't do what we did with all of those other ones, and there were still millions of them out there in pristine factory configurations, then they still wouldn't be worth anything. It's like having, there's 10 billion Hiluxes out there. They're not worth fuck all, realistically, unless there's fuck all of them. Then the price of them goes up. They then become collectible. So you can't really have one without the other, is the point I'm trying to make. Now we get into the modern era, and this is where we can draw parallels, because we as modern humans cannot really fully understand what people did 60 to 100 years ago. We can't sit in that frame of mind. You can't dig up granddad out of the fucking ground and go, hey mate, what were you thinking back then? What was your thought process? But we can kind of try, right? So picture this. Let's just say the country you live in, the M4 is the current service rifle. You're allowed to buy a civilian version of that current service rifle. We'll call it an AR-15. Someone comes to you and says, you can't change that to how you want it to be, because if you do, you're deviating from the military pattern. You have to build it exactly how the military has it, because you've got to keep it military. Don't change it at all. Don't change your handguard, don't change the sights, or whatever you do, don't change the stock. You've got to keep it how the military has it. And you go, well, the way the military has it is shit. It doesn't fit how I want to use that rifle. It doesn't look the way I want it to look. It doesn't feel the way I want it to feel. So can you kind of understand that 100 years ago, If someone had said to them, you've got to keep it military, you've got to keep it exactly how the military use it because 80 years from now, that might be worth money. And you're going, well, I don't give a bloody shit because I'm going to be dead by then. How the fuck am I going to use my rifle for hunting now when it's to keep a collectible for something that's going to happen in 80 years' time? You wouldn't. You would just use the rifle the way that you want to use it. So that's the parallel we can draw between telling someone nowadays, you've got to keep that AR-15 exactly mil spec, and you can't change that K98 into a sporting rifle. That's just the way that I like to look at it. Now, obviously, in today's age, 2023, if you have a pristine, fully factory K98 or 1942 Lithgow SMLE, obviously nowadays, don't sporterize it because you're wrecking something that is of value. But in that same token, just because something looks factory doesn't mean it is. Now, there's a shitload of SMLEs out there that don't have matching serial numbers. They've got dog shit wood on them. The wood is all different colors. It's got parts on it from, you might have Mark III parts on a Mark III Star. You might have all these, some parts are Parkerized, some parts are blued, and someone's just thrown this rifle together out of parts that don't match. And they're selling it off as a fully stock factory rifle. And some idiot out there is going to pay top dollar for that. What this does is drives the market up, because then someone goes, well, I sold a dog shit gun for $1,500, therefore all of these dog shit guns are worth $1,500. Things are only worth what you're willing to pay for them. Now, if you're willing to pay $1,500 for a dog shit gun that doesn't match, then now everyone else has to pay at least $1,500 for a dog shit gun. So stop driving the market up. If it's not an actual factory military surplus gun that is worth the money, do not pay the money for it. I would rather see that gun get sporterized and used in the field for hunting or used at the target range for shooting and someone's getting some work out of it than someone putting a dog together, calling it a cat and selling it off as a poodle. All right, that's my 2 cents on military sporter rifles. I personally love them. No, you should not be changing your factory good guns into milsurps nowadays, but if it has been done, and there's plenty of cheap, particularly Mausers out there, that you can build a perfectly good hunting rifle off, then why the bloody hell not? I'd rather see that gun out getting used than stuffed in a cupboard just because it is what it is. I hope you got something out of that. I'll see you next video, and hooroo.